Welcome to Conversations in Color, a weekly series committed to open, honest conversation and exploring hard questions regarding race and racism in Western Wisconsin and beyond. Here is your host, Ed Hudgens.
Well, hello there and welcome to Conversations in Color this week. We're so glad that you have joined us. We are emanating, as always, from the beautiful Jamp Theater in the Pablo Center in downtown Eau Claire. And we love this beautiful setup here and the fact that we get to take advantage during this time of COVID. Well, the one silver lining for me that there's not shows in here is we get to do this here. Otherwise, I sure wish they could do shows here. So this Conversations in Color is all about leaning in on race issues, racial justice issues. And we have a certain way that we want to have these conversations. Three kind of pillars to the ethos of the show. One is honesty, where we are committed to leaning in on hard questions, and we're not going to shy away from hard subjects. One is humility. We're going to come into the conversation knowing full well how limited and frail we are, and that we really don't know everything there is to know about most things. And then we are committed to humanity. Seeing the dignity and value in each human being and upholding that dignity and value in our conversation. So nobody's going to get vilified or degraded or dehumanized as a part of these conversations. As per usual, I am joined by my partner in crime. She is a professor of history at UW Eau Claire. She is the president of Uniting Bridges. She is a troublemaker at large. My friend, Dr. CiC Ducksworth-Lawton. Welcome, CiC.
Glad to be here. Glad to be back, and definitely happy to be here with our distinguished guests.
Yes,
I feel very happy about this.
Yes, and so let's introduce everybody to these wonderful guests. First off, we have Christine Orlowski. She is a pastoral associate doing lay ministry at St. James the Greater Catholic Church here in town. She's been doing that for about 5 years. Before that, she was the director of campus ministry for Catholics at UW Stout. She has an MDiv in kind of focused on scripture and Catholic social teaching, which is very pertinent for what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to the show, Christine. So glad to have you.
Thank you.
We've got next up Pastor Paul Smith, who is the lead pastor at Westridge Church here in Eau Claire. He's been there for it's 11 years, or is it longer than that?
11 years in the lead pastor position.
Okay.
And then worked with students.
Okay, gotcha. So you've been there for a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. And you've been in ministry since 1999.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, you got a couple of years of pastoral experience. So glad that you're here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We have Dr. Phil Ruge-Jones, who is the pastor at Grace Lutheran Church, author of a couple of books, and he's contributed to other publications as well. Taught theology at Texas Lutheran University for 18 years. So he's got some of that academic stuff going on as well as that contact directly with the folks in his church. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right. Last but certainly not least is the esteemed and highly regarded Adam Akala, who is going to be over there. He works with CoLab. He does a lot. He is also a troublemaker at large with us. And a central part of this whole thing. Mm-hmm. Adam, what are you going to be doing over there tonight?
Yeah, I'll be focusing on our community engagement side of things. So if you have questions for our panelists and want to get involved in the conversation tonight, feel free to drop those questions in the chat if you're joining us on Paragon on Pablo Center's and Wind Technologies platform. If you are listening to us on 99.9 FM Converge Radio, you can call 715-600-0267. That's 715-600-0267. And we'll add those questions into our conversation tonight as they come in. So feel free to drop those questions and get involved in the conversation with us.
All right. Well, thank you, Adam. Do you have something to get us kicked off here?
I do. To lighten the conversation before we dig into some of these hard topics, I have our icebreaker for the night. So, Ed, I'll start with you. Aside from what you currently do, as a kid, what is something you wanted to do when you grew up?
I'm going to go with the fun one because I wanted to do a bunch of different things. But in my teen years, I wanted to be a professional wrestler. And my wrestling name was Ed Thunder. And I did backyard wrestling videos with some of my friends. They were not great. Yeah, and still at 49 years old, there's still a part of me that wants to do that. So, yeah.
Never too late.
Not your back.
Never too late. You know?
Not your back, trust me.
That's right. So, I don't know. Christine, how about you?
I wanted to be a ballet dancer and a fiction writer. I went to college for those two things before I changed my mind and went in totally different directions.
All right. Cool. Paul, how about you?
Well, I'm a transplant from mid-state Illinois, a little south of Chicago, and so as a kid, I just wanted to be a linebacker for the Chicago Bears.
You can hear the boos in the background.
I was imagining those, yes. And so, but didn't have the skill or the intangibles to do so.
All right. Phil.
I was and am a big reader, and so I'd read through all the Hardy Boy books, and I wanted to be a fingerprint expert for the FBI.
Nice.
And then I was getting the God and Country Award, which is a Boy Scout award, and you have to write an essay about how you will implement your work with your faith in God, and I couldn't come up with anything, so I said, I'm going to be a pastor, because it was an easier essay.
Quite a leap.
My dad's a pastor, I could never turn back after that, so I was kind of stuck on my
expert
path.
to pastor. That's a
Dragged into the
There's got to be a connection.
Yeah.
somehow.
There's got to be. Salika.
So I had two. I wanted to be a fashion designer. And ironically, if you know either of my children, everywhere they go, they usually have pads with them and they're drawing. And I used to be very much like that. I would always be drawing and do things like that. And then I gave that up because people told me fashion designers would never be able to, support themselves. But I wanted to be a classical pianist because my mom was a professor of music and she was classically trained. Flute, organ, and keyboardist. She still is. She's just not, she doesn't have a church right now. She's 85. You're allowed to retire. And there's still a part of me that wonders if I should have chased the piano dream. So I still play and I still gig a little and goof off a little. And I have keyboards in my house.
Nice.
So the dream is alive.
More reasonable version of the dream.
It's not dead yet.
It's not dead yet.
Oh, boy.
It's just mutated.
A Monty Python reference.
Good for you, Phil.
I love it. I just exposed my 11-year-old to the Holy Grail a couple weeks ago, and he laughed so hard.
Holy hand grenade.
Adam, how about you?
When I was younger, I wanted to be a doctor when I grew up. And I still have those aspirations, not necessarily a medical doctor, but potentially going for my PhD in something. But ended up going into music in college, and so that, I suppose, kind of spirals into being an actor, being a musician. And I'm lucky that I get to volunteer and work with the Eau Claire Children's Theater to be able to do that as an adult, and just kind of as a hobby, as a pastime, instead of as a career.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're not professional necessarily, but you did win a big award here recently, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, my partner Brooke Petska and I took first place in Dancing with the Eau Claire Stars, so technically first runner-up, but first place there.
All right. Well, our subject matter for tonight, we're talking about Jesus, Christianity, and racial justice. And if you're tuning in, you may be asking yourself, why in the world are we focusing just on Christianity? Where is that coming from? Why aren't we talking about Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism or any other faith background or heritage when it comes to racial justice? Before I get into talking through that a little bit, one thing I want to make sure that everybody understands is this show is apolitical. I'm just going to say it this way, Salika and I, we really don't like either of the parties a whole lot. So we don't play favorites with that. We care about policies. But what we're going to talk about tonight isn't about red and blue states. It's not about right and left. It's about something else. But we do need to focus in on somebody who is associated a little bit we need to focus in a little bit on somebody who is associated with Republicans right now, and that's President Trump. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about him, but if you saw the debate last week with him and former Vice President Joe Biden, or you saw some of the highlights, you probably are aware of this one moment in the debate in which President Trump was pressed to denounce white supremacy, and to put it delicately, he struggled to do so, and basically made a comment about Proud Boys standing back and standing by, or standing down, something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was, but the basic gist of it was that he did not come out and clearly denounce white supremacy. Now, how this ties in with our subject matter for tonight is that the truth of the matter is white Christians in America put him in office in 2016. White evangelicals, 80% of all white evangelical voters voted for President Trump in 2016. And that support continues now, even in 2020. As of a couple months back, Pew Research said that 80% of white evangelicals say they're still going to vote for him in the upcoming election. 72% of white evangelicals approve of President Trump's job performance right now. And that's just, oh, by the way, compared to 12% of black evangelicals who approve of his job performance. But beyond that, it's not just about evangelicals. White Protestants that are not from an evangelical background, 56% approve of his job that he's doing. And 54% of white Catholics approve of the job that he's doing. So again, this isn't about Republicans and Democrats. I just want to make sure we are very clear about that. This is not about politics. This is about an individual who has made some very racially charged statements, who would not overtly, explicitly denounce white supremacy, and that person is being supported in large part by white Christians. So that's why we're focusing in on that tonight, because it has a direct impact on these racial justice discussions that we're having. So my question to the group here, and actually I'm gonna ask Salika first, if you would give a little context quickly before we get into this question about the kind of the segregation in the church between white and black.
Well, that segregation starts in 1619 when the Anabaptists are going to welcome African Americans who are slaves in the colonies to the church, and will argue for humanity, as opposed to the people who are the Puritans, who will see them as inferior. And the evolving Calvinist doctrine in that time period, which argued in part that if you had power, it was because of God looking on you as fortunate. And if you did not have power, that was a sign that you were not predestined for heaven. Which elements of that idea will get yanked into certain political sects, and it'll divide those sects as we move into being a country, 1780s, and especially in the 1820s. In the 1820s, you have a giant revival that's called the Second Great Awakening, and it's a Christian revival, and it argues that you should learn to read the Bible for yourself, and that your salvation was unmediated by others, not by your pastor. It was based on you. And that goes two different ways, because the Gospels don't say that there's such a thing as, shall I put it, individual responsibility for salvation. But you will have some sects that will do that, and other sects will talk more about a communitarian interpretation. From that Great Awakening, you get three great reform movements that we still have today. Then it was abolitionism and anti-slavery, led by free blacks and white Methodists, white Lutherans, and white remnant Anabaptists, who become independent Baptists in the North. In the South, you will have religion bent to the will of the planters, who tended to be much more atheist. And one of the things people don't understand is the reason why you don't see an official religion in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights is the planters did not want any limit on their abilities to abuse slaves or indentured workers in order to get more work out of them. I'm not going to go too far in it, but if you really look at Leviticus and you really look at Deuteronomy, American slavery was not Christian, and it didn't follow any of those rules. And all these people who are trying to say it was biblical and it was okay, I don't know what Bible they're reading.
All right, so I sense you can riff right now a little bit more, but let's
let me speed up. So we get 1848. You get a split in the Baptist. The Southern Baptist Convention is created explicitly to bend Baptist theology to protecting slavery. And the other split will be your independent Baptists. 1865, at the end of the Civil War, blacks try to join the Southern Baptist Convention. They are rejected. And that is, they will create the National Baptist Convention. Same with some Southern Methodist conventions will refuse to integrate, and that is the creation of the African Methodist Church, which is now subsumed in the United Methodists, although you still see AME churches today. My father was AME. And the AME Church and the Lutheran Church, if we look at Oberlin, Ohio, etc., it has been those Christian faiths that have fought Jim Crow, fought segregation as the white allies of African Americans. The independent Baptists, the independent churches, the Council of Churches have been had played huge roles. On the other hand, there are those who have always argued that Christianity means that African Americans are inferior. They will corrupt the story of Noah and call blacks the sons of Ham. Now, of course, if you're actually reading it, it's really clear that's not. You're not seeing Namibia. You're not seeing those names in there. But there's a lot of corruption of Christianity. I will call these people, they're not Christians, they're Christianists, to try to protect white supremacy. And the genius of Martin Luther King was to, in many ways, take back Christianity for interracial love. And that's where those 6 principles of nonviolence are today. So we still see a fight in the Christian church between interracialism, loving the outsider, and power. And we still see churches who use the idea of individual salvation as an excuse to avoid doing racial justice, or who will argue that abortion is a greater sin than racism, or who try to litmus Christianity in a way that gives them power. And the arguments that you saw in 1618 and 1619 of predestination, of who is God's favorites, of who should rule over who, or should we all be God's children together in a beloved community? Those arguments are still here today. And they unfortunately divide our churches. Last point, though, 1999, the Southern Baptist Convention and the Catholic Church gave apologies. The Southern Baptist Convention gave an apology for being segregated so long, and it finally integrated. I will point out that the Southern Baptist Convention has now had 2 black presidents. The Catholic Church apologized in 1999 because 2000 was Jubilee year, and apologized for protecting the slave trade and protecting Spain and Portugal for the decimation of the Middle Passage. and for the racism that was inherent in colonization done by Catholics who were Europeans under and defended as God's will.
So I'm gonna pose the question with that context. We have all that background, and we have these movements in the Southern Baptist Convention and in the Catholic Church to seek forgiveness and apologize for the past. But the truth is that people talk about Sunday morning is the most segregated time of the week. That still holds true. And then when I throw in the layers of the things I was talking about earlier, with the disparity between support for President Trump, and I got to reiterate, specifically, we're talking about a guy who has said some things that make it sound like he's got some racist ideology going on, would not denounce white supremacy. The disparity in support of him between white Christians and black Christians here in America. And so I need to throw this out to you. Why? Why is there this disparity? Why? So, Salika, we need to let them talk now.
Well, I was going to shape the question for you and take Trump out of it.
Okay.
Let me shape the question. 85% of white evangelicals, and there was a research that came out last week, believe that God is white, and because God is white, that means white people should rule over the earth. And we have surveys that show, and I'll be honest, white evangelicals, white Catholics, and white Protestants have majorities who support the idea that racism is sometimes appropriate, that discrimination is acceptable, and that racial justice should not be high on the agendas of churches. What is going on that divides white churches and allows that away from black, Latino, and indigenous churches where social justice is the #1 priority?
All right, so there's all that. Do something with that.
Yeah, because I want to take Trump out because it isn't really about Trump. It
He's
really
just a
is
lightning
about
rod.
this division.
Yep.
It's about this division.
Part of it is, I think, and this is only one small part, but it's a part, that people tend to see racial justice as an inherently political issue, whereas things like abortion is not inherently political in this worldview, and so they want to keep politics out of the church. So the church is supposed to be involved with moral issues, and they see racial justice as a political issue, but not necessarily a moral issue. Or maybe that's not fair. Maybe it's just that it's more political. So let's throw that out there as one possible reason. And I think, as a Catholic, we have done a poor job of, teaching our young and everyone in the Catholic Church that social justice isn't inherently a part of the church. We just sort of say, oh yeah, it's a good thing, but that's just one of the many things you have to learn. And so it's not given the, we have Pope after Pope after Pope, where the U.S. bishops have said that Catholic social teaching, which is the body of work at how Catholics can behave in society, and it's really kind of mind-blowing when you read it. They said, you can't have a good Catholic education unless you've studied Catholic social teaching, but nobody's heard of it. Or they see a one-page, and there's just thousands of documents, and they see a little one-page summary and say they know about Catholic social teaching. Well, yeah, human dignity, I know about that. But so the total lack of education. It's really, really easy to just gloss over the Beatitudes and the whole Sermon on the Mount and say, I've talked enough. You guys go.
Pick up one thing there. Catholics are the last religious group to join the civil rights movement. nuns and priests were not allowed to march until 1965, until Selma. I had put a picture up on Facebook, which was on the Investure in 1963, of the first black man to be invested as a bishop. Black men were not allowed to study to be priests in the United States until the 1950s. That's at Holy Word. The first seminary that would accept them was Holy Word Seminary in Mississippi.
So
the Catholics have been late to the game. And the ironic thing was there was a woman in the picture as Bishop Perry was walking by, and there's a priest looking at her, and her sign said, "Jesus did not call non-whites as apostles."
Except
and it's in New
for-
Orleans,
yeah.
so it's my people, you know.
except all of them are.
Except for they were all, Middle Eastern Jews, but sure.
Yeah, details.
Just details. And that's, that's the thing that drives me crazy, is because the Catholic Church should have been the first one. If you know anything about the history and the teachings of the church, you should have been the first ones on the line. So I think all Christians should, if you've paid any attention to Scripture whatsoever. But we didn't allow. Like you said, we didn't allow black men to become priests, and so the Catholics never saw a black priest. They never saw blacks in leadership in the church, and then just sort of stopped this flow. So what you don't see, you don't engage with.
All right, so we've bashed on the Catholics enough for a little bit.
Yay!
Let's talk about Lutherans and evangelicals a little bit.
And I think it's similar to what's already been mentioned, that the glaring inconsistency within not just Catholicism, but Protestantism, evangelicalism, is there is oftentimes the singular focus on the one justice issue of the unborn, that life matters. But as you mentioned, looking back through history, if one is looking at the Bible, you cannot help but notice that it opens with a celebration of racial equality. Let us create Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, humankind in our image, the God image. And then one of my favorite passages in Revelation, the eternal scene of heaven, that moves me every time I read it, that the uniqueness that each ethnicity portrays that God image, and the beauty of it that is celebrated. When the scene is portrayed, every tongue, tribe, and nation, so that uniqueness and that diversity is maintained. And I think it is because of a lack of comprehensive and balanced presentation of the gospel. We're all a product of our culture. And then I think also when you live in a culture that has the scars of racism that we do, when you find yourself in the majority, which there's this latent under the surface guilt, I think, that people don't want to admit. And so rather than addressing it, which is what the gospel calls us to do, there's this carnal, sinful compulsion to, well, maybe if I just don't talk about it or think about it, it'll just go away. But that is not what happens. It just compounds.
It's a self-defense mechanism.
Yeah.
Yep. Phil, what do you think?
Well, just like up front, our denomination is the second whitest denomination in the country. We have great social statements too, and so it's something we have good things we say, but it's harder to implement it.
Yeah.
And so I would highlight two things: that the voices we've heard, and therefore the Jesus they've presented, have been white male voices in my whole lifetime, or when I was born, and moving forward. Other voices have come in, and I think they brought their own stuff to the Scriptures and saw it there, even if it wasn't there. And that we still struggle with that. You just go in any of the churches I'm familiar with and look at what country you would think Jesus is from and what race within the country, and it's pretty white Jesus. So I think, and God, the same thing. And so that reinforcing of whiteness in our most sacred images is a part of it. And then I'm a little more skeptical. I think we have that white people have power, and the logical thing is to interpret things so that you maintain that power. And so that's a big piece that we'd have to confess and get over, and it would mean changing our lifestyles, and I don't know that people are up for that, not high on their priority.
So do you feel like when we're talking about this disparity between, because we've heard from you all a little bit about how you understand Jesus, the gospel, the kingdom of God, that kind of thing. Like for me, the first, what may have been Jesus' first sermon in Luke 4, where he's talking about the year of Jubilee, basically the year of the Lord's favor, where everything will be set right, debts are canceled, captives set free. That's potentially like the first thing he's telling people. So the marginalized are supposed to be prioritized and all these things. There's obviously a disparity between that image of Jesus and what we're seeing in the church by and large. And now let's just be honest, we're all screwed up. So it doesn't matter whether you go to church every day of the year or you never go into the door of a church or whatever, or you never pray or whatever. We're all fundamentally flawed and screwed up. Let's be straight about that.
True that.
Yes, but still, there's you guys are leaning in a little bit on, I think, a couple different things. I think that I would love to talk about a little bit more, and that's first of all how that frailty and human limitation and flawedness, is that the right word? That imperfection plays into this, like that the desire to serve self. And then related to that, the idea of maintaining power, consolidating power, preserving power. What else? Do you guys have other thoughts about that? I mean, how does that sit with you?
I was just thinking, it's a consistent theme in Scripture, prophets, Jesus, just consistently that if we are to be in relationship with God, we're to do so as a community, taking care of the vulnerable among us. That's what God wants from us, and that's crystal clear throughout all of Scripture. And yet it's intriguing because for the most part, most churches don't do that. And I've thought about that a lot, and it's almost like, if you really listen to pay attention to the Sermon on the Mount, you kind of recoil because it sounds too hard. What Jesus asks, it's.
Yep.
And
loving your enemies.
Yeah, it just sounds it's unrealistic, and so you sort of recoil and brush it off. And I think that I like to believe, and perhaps this is too optimistic, that people aren't deliberately clinging to power so much as they're just wincing away from the radical nature of what Jesus asks of us.
Yeah, and I would concur. I think to build on that I don't think any of us is comfortable admitting that there are some within the church and without the church, that there really truly is a proactive wanting to hold on to and grasp and maintain positions of power and privilege and the like. But then there are others. Embedded in the gospel is this part of the message that you never judge the whole on a part. That's really the whole justification by grace through faith, that we're justified, and then over the course of our lives, the unsanctified parts are sanctified. And so I think there's a litany of factors within the church that you also have that flawed part of us, the sin nature, where I think some people are, it's almost imperceptible, because the Bible describes it really as, ironically, what we've all been living through for the past 7 months, this systemic, spiritual, communicable disease, sin. We didn't ask for it. It's just here and we're all dealing with it.
But the mask won't help you.
But the mask will not help you. And so then some people with, let's just say, COVID, they're infected, they're walking around, they're spreading it unknowingly, you could say innocently. And there is an aspect to sin. The Bible unequivocally identifies racism as a sin, something that Jesus died to abolish. And we see him wrangling with that in the Gospels, and yet people knowingly and then unknowingly propagate it, partially because of this disease that we all have, because we are first souls or spirits that happen to have these bodies for a period of time, and that sin is just pervasive in detectable and undetectable ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a phrase, and I was going to look it up, and I forgot, but one of you might know a early Catholic theologian who says something like, "You have not yet measured the weight of sin," or "You have underestimated the weight of sin." And so the New Testament talks about principalities and powers, that there are forces that are very strong that we're caught up in and are often unaware of that, but they're dictating the way we live our lives. And I think that that's an important thing to look at, and that's very different than an individual understanding of sin. And so there's kind of a parallel between just me and Jesus and me and my neighbors, that I can wing it. We'll do fine. And I don't think we understand how deeply systemic racism is woven into the fabric of every element of our lives, so that, and I think I like the image of it, that it's a principality and power, almost like it has agency itself, so that even it can use good intentions and bad intentions, it doesn't matter, and take it captive for its power, and so that, to its power, to do damage to people. And so that means to get out of it is a long haul, a difficult process, and it's not going to be instant gratification. Oh, good, we changed that. Right. Because the system just morphs to reabsorb in a different way faith stances that can become racist in a different way.
Well, and if I could jump in on that, I think that's a really great point. But I also find it's interesting, the three of us are all white. Mm. And so there is, I'm going to guess, at least I can only speak for myself, there are myriads of things that I don't know about racism in my church because I've never experienced it. And so for me to talk about, well, what causes it or where is that, I don't feel like I even have a grasp of the it there.
It's interesting. Black Catholics, I'm a black Catholic, baptized. My family has been Catholic in Louisiana, according to my cousins doing the genealogies, since before this country was a country. Mm-hmm. We are 1% of the black community. We don't even make it to 1 million. And we are expected to assimilate. Mm-hmm. And we're really expected to ignore racism. Which kind of gets me pulling off of what you're saying. There are people in our church and in the other churches who, when you bring up the Sermon on the Mount, when you bring up the Beatitudes, when you bring up Jesus' words, they'll say, but that wasn't really meant for black people, because they think there is a natural law. They will say there is a natural law. The crazy minister who was on campus last October, who I tangled with, when I said Jesus loves everyone and I quoted the Sermon on the Mount, he said, well, that's book truth. That's not revealed truth. And he argues, and you see it in the South, these people who argue that there's a natural law that you're not supposed to
Violate. Yeah.
bring the races together, that we were supposed to be segregated. Does that segregation feed into this idea that allows these churches to maybe avoid wrestling with the Sermon on the Mount? How does
Absolutely.
segregation?
Because if you don't experience it, it's, we think all three of us have mentioned this already. If you don't experience it, if you're not aware of it, if we're just happy in our little white bubble, then you don't have a access to confront it. Not coming up. Help me out, guys. I mean, if we only have white male leaders, quite frankly, most of us do, you just don't have the access. You don't know.
All right.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Jump in, please.
Well, I was thinking back to what you said earlier. I can't think the exact term that you, Christian-ish, or where it's not really...
Christianists.
Okay, yes, thank you. And I think that, outside of Christendom and theology, you have philosophy and philosophers, and then you have street philosophy, where people have dabbled enough where they know enough to be dangerous. And so I think that the Christian version of that is just a partial narrative of the gospel, because the whole incarnation is Jesus taking the time to relate with the disenfranchised, those of us who are sinners. And so the Sermon on the Mount, or Jesus' teaching in Matthew of who does society currently say is the least? Or who do you, in the deep, dark places you don't want to talk about, who do you feel is the least? Well, how you proactively pursue that person, try to understand that person, get to know them, so you have some point of reference, that is actually how you are relating with or knowing Jesus, because he said, that's how I'm going to credit your behavior as knowing me. And so if we only surround ourselves with white people or our own kind, whatever that means, then there is no possible way for a person to start navigating through. There's individual sanctification, but there's also social or societal sanctification, because as you mentioned, this idea of I can just have this individualistic salvation, me and Jesus, apart from any other human being, that is nowhere in the Bible, unless they're reading a different Bible I haven't heard of. And so, therefore, part of being a follower of Jesus is how many people of a different ethnic group have I actually proactively taken the time to befriend, get to know, listen to, ask questions, understand. And then as we talk and dialogue, we better understand the gospel itself.
Do you think, we put the figures on the board, do they say more about race than religion? Do they say that race is more important than religion in many ways, in the way these people vote? Because we're making this correlation that white evangelical means something here. Are they voting this way in spite of being evangelical? In spite of being Catholic?
Or
In
do they
spite
see
of
it as
being
an
Protestant?
expression of that?
Do they see it as an identity? Do they see it as an expression of it? That's absolutely, thank you. That was very eloquent way to put it. Is this an expression of their faith, or is this in spite of their faith?
Or is it compartmentalized to where you're thinking about how you vote as something separate than how you practice your faith?
Is your faith private and your race public?
On that note, before you talk about that, I got to do something, because we're already like 45 minutes in. I told you this stuff, we're going to fly.
It goes fast.
If you have just joined us, you're listening to Conversations in Color. Maybe you're watching us. on the Pablo stream. So glad that you're listening in. And if you've just joined us here recently, you may not know who we have here talking. And so I want to make sure you know. My name is Ed Hudgens, and I'm hosting this thing. We've got my partner, resident panelist, Dr. Salika Ducksworth-Lawton here. Right here beside me is Christine Orlowski, who is pastoral associate with St. James the Greater Church. We've got Pastor Paul Smith from West Ridge Church and Pastor Phil Ruge Jones from Grace Lutheran Church. So the question, I'm sorry. Okay, well, Adam, you're there monitoring the questions. If you guys have questions, please let us know. Get in touch with Adam.
Drop in the chat. Otherwise, if you are listening to us on Converge Radio, you can call 715-600-0267, and we'll get those questions added into the chat tonight.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. All right, so let's get back to that question because I think it's an important question. When we look at the statistics and look at 72% of white evangelicals, over 50% of white non-evangelical Protestants, over 50% of white Catholics, supporting the president's job, like he's doing a good job. And this is not about his job performance. This is about, the whole picture of looking at what he brings to the table, specifically when it comes to racial justice issues and race issues altogether. Do you guys think that those folks are voting or supporting that kind of movement or policy from a place of faith, like this is an expression of their faith? Is it something where they're doing it in spite of their faith and what they believe? Or is it something where there's some kind of compartmentalization happening where church life and political life don't really relate with one another?
And again, I'd kind of like to take Trump out of it and just say, are they refusing to see racism? Because when you look at surveys, they're always saying, we don't see racism, we think black people are equal, we think whites are the most persecuted. Or worse, they will say they think there is a correlation with being a person of faith and thinking African Americans are subhuman.
A white person of faith.
Yes, a white person of faith. Is that in spite of their faith? Is that an expression of their faith? Is that a compartmentalization of their faith? Is this where they're trying to say there's this God's law?
Yeah, we're asking y'all to speak on behalf of millions of white Christians in America. So.
I'm just asking you to speak for yourself.
No pressure.
Well, I could just say I personally have never heard, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I absolutely believe he does, but I have personally never heard this theory that God, natural law, ordained non-whites to be subhuman. I believe you because you know more than me about these things, but I personally have never heard it. I can say that quite a few people will say that when you look at the various issues in the world, abortion is the most important. And that trumps everything. Not Trump as in Trump, but Trumps as in outweighs
as in the
everything. And, racial justice is there as an issue, but it's way out, trumped.
Well, there's this stereotype. If you look at the Kuhn stereotype in the Sapphire, is that black people are inherently immoral. And just this weekend, Middleton and Madison were leafleted by people saying that undocumented immigrants and people of color should be sent back because they cannot have white babies. There's some really awful videos, Senator James Eastland in 1963, from the 60s and 70s, and a much more recent one, I want to say it's 2016, of a white pastor at an Ohio church saying that he would not perform interracial marriages for this reason that I showed to my students. And of course, this person got a giant amount of pushback. I'm glad you haven't met them. It's unfortunate that they do exist.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the question that's still hanging out there, though, what do you how do you guys feel about this? Like, it's with the statistics we're using, it's hard. It's not an apples to apples comparison because, again, like you said, Christine, the abortion issue is a primary issue for a lot of Christians in America. But aside, just laying that aside and just considering maybe the willingness to overlook racial injustice issues as when you're voting, what do you guys attribute that to? What do you feel? How do you feel about that?
I mean, I personally think that it's fairly complex and nuanced in the sense that I don't think that there's even close to a singular answer. I think that, as you indicated, for certain evangelicals, Catholics, the unborn human being justice issue that is a biblical issue, it has so been singularly focused on that it has drowned out the equal importance of all of the other human rights issues that have equal airtime in the scriptures. One doesn't need to put forth much effort to find how many times racism as a sin and an atrocity is addressed. I think for others, there is, due to tragic biblical illiteracy, a confusion of if I'm a Christian, then I must belong to said political party and ideology. Mm-hmm. And then I think there's just the mass social crowd influence. Well, everybody else seems to be doing this, so maybe I should as well. But not, just speaking for evangelicalism within Protestantism, remembering that is not the church, that is not Christianity, that is a sect within, and they don't all necessarily agree. And so I think those would be three factors that contribute to those numbers, all of which I feel compelled to say are not a reflection of the primary instructions of the Bible itself,
right,
or Jesus himself.
Right.
I want to flip it and say, where do I see hope in terms of this? And I would say in younger people who are making friends across races and having to hear the stories in the background,
yep,
that just shifts things for them. So like I think of my kids and their experience, my experience compared to my parents' experience, and the amount of interaction between races is changing things. Not magically, not as quickly as it should, but to me, that's where I see hope. And so that's why I think I don't think it's a conscious thing. It's just you're white people hanging out with white people. You think white thoughts.
Right.
You interpret things. You see something happen, say with the police, and you interpret it out of that lens.
Yeah.
Right? And it's very different if you have people you know and are listening to the thousands of ways they're experiencing microaggressions, and I never even thought of that. That when I said that's how it made you feel, right? So I think that, to me, that gives me hope. And then maybe some kind of international possibility. So the Lutheran Church, the whitest denomination here, but we have more Lutherans in the southern hemisphere than we do in the northern hemisphere. I think that would surprise even white Christians here. That Germany is not where the homeland is these days, right? We should go to Tanzania if you want to meet some typical Lutherans these days. And so I'm hoping that those kinds of conversations and relationships, because that's where I think a shift is going to happen, when you have a larger expanse of reality that you've been exposed to, and people who are agents within that you begin to interpret things differently.
It goes back to what Paul was saying earlier about having those relationships, that you have to meet people and have the relationships to
eye to eye.
Can we bring it back to the Chippewa Valley?
Yes.
When I first moved here in 1993, and I joined, I'm going to pick on Catholics. I joined a Catholic church.
You're a Catholic, so you have the right to
I'm a
do
Catholic. I get to do that. I joined a Catholic church. I'm not going to say the name to protect the miscreants.
The guilty? Oh.
actually, this is closer to 1999 when my child was born. And I asked if, could we have a jazz mass? Could we have any African American music? Because, what you said about 11 o'clock, I mean, it's not just segregated by people, it's segregated by music.
Aesthetic.
It's the aesthetic. And I mean, even in the Catholic Church, if you go to a majority black Catholic church, there's even a different altar arrangement. So I was here, I think I was one of the only, no, there were no other black people in that church at that point in time. And I was told no, because if they allowed music by Kirk Franklin or jazz masses in, it would open the door for the polka mass. And I have heard variations of that across multiple churches in this area for about the last 30 years. It's gotten better. In the last 10 years, I think Kirk Franklin has made inroads. But there's still a reluctance to accept the concerns sometimes of our multicultural churchgoers. And it's not just the Catholic Church. I've seen it with the Lutherans. I've seen it with evangelicals. When I'm the director for Uniting Bridges of the Martin Luther King program, so I get to visit a lot of churches. So it took us 10 years with the King program to really get into the majority of the churches. How do we break the comfort barrier for the whites who are here, who don't want us, they still want to be singing the same Holy Holy. They want to be singing, do not let your hearts be troubled. Whereas occasionally I would like to be saying, God is, something with a little syncopation. I have actually had a church musician, again, I'm not going to say the name to protect the guilty, when I suggested adding syncopation to a song that was a Negro spiritual, I was told, I don't do syncopation. I don't do dotted quarter notes.
So I think your question, though, is a really pertinent one. And when I think of, just my understanding of the Bible, I think, especially when I look at the New Testament and I look at the person of Jesus, comfort is never a part of the equation. And so, but we seem to be addicted to it. How do we break through that? Like that, I think, Phil, something you said earlier is highly pertinent to all of this. It's that innate desire to maintain power. Same thing with comfort. Mm-hmm. This innate desire to preserve self when it comes down to it and look out for self. What do we do with that? How do we break through that in terms of segregation, in terms of racial issues?
Oh, we're looking at me.
Well, I'm looking at you.
I'm looking at y'all. I asked the question. And there's a community question. So, do we want to put this question aside and do the community question?
All right, we'll let you guys
because my
think about it for a
question is
second.
really, really huge. I admit it.
Yeah. Adam, what you got?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily so much a question as just a comment. So the last question was kind of posed in a way that we're talking about Christians potentially being single-issue voters, and that's the only reason that they vote one way or the other, specifically on abortion. I pulled up a Gallup poll that was done in July 2020 that finds that 30% of Americans do find abortion as a key voting issue for them. And 24% actually say that their candidate that they vote for needs to share the same view on abortion as they do. One of our viewers also just said, perhaps those who vote a certain way believe the policies that they are voting for actually are the best political policies for social justice. One could argue that a political party who has controlled the policies of certain cities for over 50 years, and yet those policies have actually hurt black people or others living in those cities. There's some evidence that you could argue that the other political party is actually more just. I'm not sure exactly what that evidence is, but I know, Salika, we did cover in a prior episode democratic control of cities and them actually having more racial injustice, not necessarily more comparatively, but having racial justice policies in place that they don't want to give up because of that white control. So I just wanted to add that into the conversation and potentially get some thoughts on it if we wanted to continue that.
I think the factual frame on that, if that's all right.
Well, do that, but let me just throw this out here again. When we talk about the other party, we are not representing the Democratic Party here. Mm-hmm. So, and I want to be clear about that because the Democrat, I'm going to say this explicitly, and Salika, you can punish me later for this, but both parties are guilty of perpetuating systemic racism. Both of them.
I'm not going to punish you for it. I mean, it's true. The problem is gerrymander, in that when any party is going to have one-party control, you're going to see corruption and abuse of power. For African Americans who tend to be clustered in cities, what that means is you add one-party rule plus segregation, it's very easy to abuse the people in the segregated space. When black nationalists and black separatists say, why, and I have had some say to me, one just this weekend, so what's so great about integration? Why do we have to be by white people? And I said, well, you know what? They're less likely to bomb you and to shoot you and to kill you and to beat you when there are white people so close that they have to hit them. When it's segregation, it's a whole lot easier to hurt you because you can target it. But when we're integrated, to be honest, we're probably physically safer. I mean, there are limits.
So that's just a very practical
It's a very practical answer. So, you know, that's why I kept trying to take Trump and the party out of the answer and move towards people of faith. Because I am very aware that there are corrupt white Democrats. I grew up with Harry Lee, who was a Democrat, who beat Mayor Morial's aides on TV, beat black people on TV. I mean, he had so many consent decrees, I think it took like 3 pages to keep track of them. And he was a Democrat. So I'm not...
Because they're every bit as fundamentally flawed as any Republican.
You know, well, we're talking Southern Democrats, too. I mean, so I'm not going to sit here and say one party is morally just. On the other hand, one party has embraced white supremacists. I do a lot of stuff with the Republican Party, and I've told several of their leaders this. You're not going to get black votes until you kick these wannabe Klansmen out of the Republican Party. Because I'm not going to go into a party with people who openly, Richard Spencer, say they want black genocide. So as a black person, my choice, and I sound like Richard Baldwin, is corruption and abuse of power, corruption and black genocide? Really? Can we do better than this? Can we do better than this?
Yeah.
And it comes back again, I think, to the Chippewa question. The question I asked y'all, what does it take to break through comfort to get people to live their faith? It appears that their comfort is more important than their faith. What does it take to change that?
And we're going to give y'all a moment to
question?
twist in the wind and...
I'm used to having crickets. I teach.
I just don't know that there's a simple answer. I mean, I can come up with like 1,000 different answers at the same time, not just one thing. It's not like there's a magic bullet.
Oh, come on,
We could
Christine.
walk around and leaflet everybody, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable and see if that works. I don't think it will. We could try.
I mean, I guess it's that I'm trying to get at. If your choice is watching me being shot on TV when I have done nothing wrong, or abortion, and you're choosing abortion over me, how am I to see you as moral?
And if I could just add to, there was a clarification from the person that gave this thought too, that just said, just wanted to bring to light that this may have been a loaded question in the way that it just implies that evangelicals are racist depending on how they vote. And that doesn't necessarily get to the heart of the issue that we're trying to kind of tackle and discuss. And I think, much like you said, Christine, there's no silver bullet. There's no like magic cure that's all of a sudden going to fix this problem. We're going to figure it out tonight. But having these honest conversations is the way that we start to untangle the complexities that exist with when you plug religion and politics into the same conversation and then also frame it through race.
Yeah.
So.
Well, let's move away from voting and even talk about there are some evangelical sects who will not marry people who, and I shouldn't say evangelical, they're sects. I'm not going to use the word there. This is the Christianist, so I'm going to separate. Who will not marry interracial couples. I'm thinking of that Mississippi fundamentalist last year who had the wedding area and wouldn't let the interracial couple rent it because she said it was because of her faith. And it, and she thought the law supported her in Mississippi and it didn't.
Well, and you gave the example of the leader in Ohio just a bit ago that said he wouldn't officiate weddings for interracial couples.
Well, I mean, it's not just the vote. Let's move away from the vote. I mean, it's things like discrimination. It's things like segregation. Here in Eau Claire, having talked to people in the health field, there are some of these people who do not want black nurses or doctors because of their faith and white supremacy, which creates problems if you're trying to do staffing.
Yep.
I mean, there are people who do not want a black IT person, and they will use their faith as an excuse. So it's discrimination on a daily basis. It's not voting. I mean, these people could be voting. I don't know how many people came up to me and said, I voted for Obama. And then they did something, that's like, that does not excuse you from racism, people. You've still got a problem here. No, you still can't do that.
Work to do.
Voting for Obama does not mean you get to use the N-word or anything like that. So it's not. Racism is. I want to disconnect racism from the politics and from the vote and push it to how do we have people of faith who still want to segregate? Who will kick a black church out of their church. I mean, we're having problems down south, this, with Baptist churches who are trying to share the same space, and it's the white congregants who don't want to do it.
So let me ask this. We'll simplify it. Is white supremacy a tenet of New Testament theology?
Oh, well, that's too
No,
easy.
hold on. Let's let them talk.
I think absolutely categorically no.
Right.
Again, as I said, the Bible begins and ends with just a poetic, beautiful, picturesque celebration of the God-ordained beauty and intentionality of racial diversity. And even within the story of Jesus, coming back to the question, how do we start to change it? I think just like when you're in a relationship with someone, they say something, they do something, and you just look at them in authentic relationship and say, are you kidding me? That's the plan. And with Jesus, it truly is a plan of one person at a time, and it leaves you feeling like, is that really going to be sufficient to sway human civilization? But then you look at 2.3 billion professing Christians on the planet, when at the end of a century after his death and resurrection, you have about 500,000 by conservative estimates. And so I think it's one person at a time. Is there anything that we can do about anti-Christian, anti-Christ, anti-Bible churches, individual professing Christians? It would be wonderful to say, you know what, an attainable goal is to rid the earth of that. But it's not going to happen.
Oh, man, this is what we're trying to do tonight, man.
I'm sorry.
There's
But what we can do is do what Jesus did, and the more you help people actually see him for who he is and his gospel. Simon of Cyrene was a black man and carried his cross. So just understanding what is embedded right within the text and the story itself. And then for those who are in places of privilege and power, in our case in conversation tonight, those who are white in our culture, being annoyingly intentional of giving voice, attention, recognition, places of position and prominence within our congregations to people who are not white, because it's more reflective of a truly biblical Christianity. And I think coming back to the Revelation 7, where Jesus is going to have the church end up, every tongue, tribe, and nation, that means what are we able to do right now with our congregational mixes that reflects that? Because Jesus said, if you really want to pray in a way that moves my heart, God, your kingdom come, your will be done as it is in heaven right now. So that means what diversity is present in our congregations right now? And what places of influence and prominence have we given to those individuals? And if we're not doing anything, start there, and also recognizing with a confession that we're being unbiblical Christians. And so what even is that?
There's a term called performative Christianity. I mean, scholars are using performative when it's in front of race, when it's in front of gender, when it's in front of Christianity, to mean that they are performing or enforcing a stereotype of Christianity that may or may not be authentic, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And that could be intentional or not, right?
Yeah. And maybe what you're trying to get at is, how do we get past this performative Christianity? Because there is definitely, there are definitely people who try to argue that a Christian culture has to include a Confederate flag and segregation and a very deterministic idea of what American life should be, and a vision of American life that never was, to be honest. Mm-hmm. A very romanticized view of that American life. But I think that performative Christianity is comfortable, and we still have to, you know, if it's one by one, what is a black person like me in Eau Claire, where we're less than one, add people from the jail, we're 1.1%. Get rid of the people in the jail, we're less than 1%. How are we supposed to find comfort in communities of faith instead of being worried that these communities of faith may harbor people who might show up on my house and burn a cross in the name of Christianity?
I think there's some little things that churches could be doing. Because I'm just go back in my head, a lot of our conversation, we just talked about, you know, living in our white bubbles in the whitest, you know, churches in town, and people just don't know. I mean, they're just not used to. They're used to always looking at pictures of blue-eyed, blonde-haired white Jesus. They've never seen a picture otherwise. So I think we could start doing little things like checking to make sure that the sacred art that we use is multicultural, checking to see if we can shake up the music a little bit, maybe not for the 8 a.m. Mass, because, you know, they're going to hate that, but for the 10 a.m. Mass, where they're a little more awake, they could have, you know, some syncopation. No offense to my 8 a.m.
canting. They've survived me cantering occasionally at 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
I will not say my voice is the best.
I was teasing my 8 o'clock people. They might actually love it. But I'm just thinking little things of talking about racial issues regularly, just getting it out there that there is something going on in the world that isn't about us white people. And we need to, you know, it is scripturally evidence that we need to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that I would say you consider that it's a spiritual discipline, right? Like for me, I think of, you know, Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The next is like it. It's connected. It's joined at the hip. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, like, the logical conclusion of that for me is if I'm a white person who is experiencing privilege and I hear stories of my black brother or sister or my Hmong brother or sister or somebody who just isn't like me in some way that's experiencing oppression or experiencing hardship in a way that I can't relate to, it's upon me to put my comfort aside. Mm-hmm. And to figure out how I can comfort them. That's like how I understand that commandment to love to work. And so for me, like as a former official leader in a Christian church and as a general troublemaker now in the name of Jesus around town, to me it's totally biblical, like sound doctrine to intentionally lean in on these things. So, like some of the things you're talking about, Christine, it just takes intentionality. Mm-hmm. You just have to make the decision you're going to do it. Mm-hmm. But you have to think that you need to first. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I throw that out there because I think the intentionality that needs to come with that can be driven by that simple idea of loving God and loving neighbor. Mm-hmm. Now, does that resonate?
I would want to add in that we have the ability to listen to voices that we never would have had before between the internet and the publishing industry. So I'll just talk about it like how I try to address this racism issues in me. I try to listen to other voices. Mm-hmm. So like my Facebook feed is one thing, but my Twitter feed, I really intentionally sought out voices of people of color to give me kind of hot takes on things as they unfold. And it just expands my world. And then I intentionally read, 1 out of 3 books should be a person of color, right? And having African American people reintroduce us to Jesus is a phenomenal thing. Mm-hmm. All the elements of his life that they've paid attention to that we've just kind of quickly passed over can really open up who Jesus is. So instead of my sense is that in the spiritual traditions I came out of, we read the Old Testament through Jesus. And so although the Old Testament is a very public kind of communal concern, it gets shrunk down to small things. Whereas the African Americans I've read understand the Exodus is fundamental to who we are, and Jesus is an embodiment of the Exodus and the prophets, right? Or the sermon that, Jesus standing up in Nazareth and saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to preach good news to the poor," right? Mm-hmm. To release to the captives, sight to the blind, the acceptable year of our favor. To hear that for some people, that's what when you think of Jesus, that's the first thing you think of, right? Or his death as a lynching, right? Which is super prevalent in black literature and black music. To like hear that and say, well, I care about Jesus, and these people are introducing me to aspects of Jesus that my blinders did not allow me to see. And I think that can begin to open us up to understand, seeing parts of reality around us, because Jesus is involved in it. He said, the least of these, he comes to us in these, can open up our world and then our communities of faith to be more understanding places.
How can we support our people of color? as they are moving into these churches, and having to deal with some people of faith who believe that assimilation is the only appropriate way, who believe that...
By assimilation, you mean that if you come in and you're not of the same cultural heritage and background, you should assimilate to the prevalent culture? Okay, just want to make sure.
So, all right, so let me use the Catholic Lutheran language. That you're going to sing the OCP and not complain about it. Mm-hmm. There will be no drums there. And why should we talk about racial justice? We should be focused on the next world and not this one. How do we make our churches comfortable without driving those people away? Comfortable for someone like me.
Doesn't it always have to be both and? Everything about Scripture and everything Jesus taught, with the kingdom of God is both and, here and not yet. And I think we have to have the people who are focused on the next world and really like David Haas, and we have to have some new people who come into our church and hear their voices. So how do we support the black people coming into a church? We need to listen to them. And if they have opinions, pay attention. You can't say, well, we only listen to the Jesuit 4. It has to be both. So we can't go completely whole hog one way or the other, but I think, I'm kind of making this up as I go, so I could be wrong, but
that's all right.
It seems like we just have to hold these things in tension, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's.
I really can't talk with my hands on radio. This is a problem. Radio people, I'm using my hands all over the place. It's really hard.
Let me throw this in. I mean, I've done some study in cross-cultural communication and when cultures come together and how that works. And I think anytime you have two different cultural backgrounds come together, there's a synthesis that happens, and that can be a healthy synthesis or it can be an unhealthy synthesis. I would say the unhealthy synthesis is where one of the cultures dictates how that synthesis is going to happen. A healthy one is where you're building a new culture together. And when I look historically at just the reality of American history and slavery, and then when slaves were set free at emancipation, one of the big struggles there is that you had one cultural group who wanted to impose on the other cultural group how the terms of the synthesis was going to work, instead of it being something together. And so I think that cultural synthesis is probably an important thing to consider when you're talking about when you have churches, or any group really, where you have people who come in from a different cultural background or persuasion. I mean, even things like language. Somebody speaks their heart language is something different than that's prevalent in the group. Figuring out ways to accommodate them becoming part of the group without erasing what they bring to the table, if that makes sense. So,
and Ed, I think another thing that a couple of you have said up here is just representation in different materials and things, and being a little bit more intentional about that. Growing up in the Lutheran faith in a country church just south of here, I basically only saw pictures of white people in my books, unless it was pictures of missionaries going to underprivileged countries and working with people of color who were less privileged than us. But I never saw people celebrating the faith that I was brought up in on the same level as me. It was always we were teaching, or we were giving, or we were doing.
We were condescending.
Yeah, exactly. And so it is those small steps, and it's not going to happen overnight. Putting up a Black Lives Matter sign in front of your church is not going to just bring all of the black people in town into your church and make them believe that it is
especially if they don't
inclusive.
Want to come in.
It's these incremental little steps to make yourself a little bit more inclusive, being intentional about it. And like you said, it goes through any community. The entrepreneurship community is the same way. Yep. We need to be intentional and make little steps towards larger change to make things better.
So we are at 8:55,
We always do.
And my guess is we could probably talk for a couple more hours, except I know a couple of people are like ready to go to bed at this point.
Or watch the Packer game we can mention that's on
Yeah,
now.
you can mention the Packers game on. So it's a really important thing, the sacrifice that you made to be here.
Yeah, well,
You
all
set
do our
it, you
thing.
set aside your comfort to anyway.
We don't know if I'd be comfortable or not. They're to score.
So let's talk. I just want to throw out there some potential action steps. So this may sound like not a concrete action step, but I think it's really important, and it's the idea of individual introspection. So we have talked at length tonight about how white supremacy is not the teaching of the New Testament. We've talked about how there is a discrepancy between the Jesus that you read about in the New Testament and some of the racist ideology that gets faith attached to it. I think that for every one of us, we need to spend some time really thinking about these things, whether or not we see ourselves in that light, that we have attached racism to our faith on some level. Because the truth of the matter is, racism really lives in all of us because we all prefer our own types. We all prefer our own people that look like us because it makes us feel better about life. Okay, that was for free. There's a little psychoanalytical, philosophical stuff there. But so take a moment and just be still. You know, like when you have a moment where you're thinking about somebody who's different than you as the other, and I'm talking specifically to those of you who are in the church world, just take a moment and be still and allow yourself that quiet space to ask yourself the question of why you're thinking that way. And why is it that the stories of racial injustice that you hear from our POC brothers and sisters, why is it easy for us to ignore those stories and just move on to the next thing? So taking a moment to just be still and think and feel through that stuff. And then I think it's upon Christian leaders, church leaders, to step up and be bold and to not be afraid of leaning hard into these issues. And not, I think Christine mentioned earlier something that's really important. Sometimes conversations about justice issues, whether it's racial justice, any kind of social justice issue, gets relegated to politics. They are not primarily political issues. They impact politics, of course, but they're human issues. And if we as those who are a part of the church and say we belong to Jesus, if we take our faith seriously, we take Jesus' word seriously, we need to be willing to lean in on these hard things and not relegate them or compartmentalize them to non-faith issues. I want to just in closing just mention this. I was raised in church. I have no hatred for Christianity, even though we've asked some poignant questions and leaned in hard on some things. And Salika went overboard in bashing Catholics tonight. So, but I was raised in church. I was telling these folks earlier, I grew up in an evangelical church, an independent, charismatic church in Chesapeake, Virginia, just a few miles down the road from Pat Robertson's CBN compound. And the university and all that stuff was just right around the corner from us. And I have been educated in evangelical schools. I have a biblical studies and theology degree from an evangelical school. And I have an intercultural leadership master's degree, again, from an evangelical school. I also mentioned to these guys earlier that when I was younger, I started listening to U2. And they started helping me, I think, a little bit like we were talking about with black brothers and sisters, helping us to see Jesus through a different filter. Listening to U2 helped me see Jesus through a different filter and made me start thinking about things like turning the other cheek and loving your enemy. And then I go deeper into the New Testament and the Apostle Paul writing things about how in Christ there's no such thing as Greek or Jew, male or female, slave or free. And then I measure that up against the segregation that we see on Sunday mornings that we were talking about earlier. And at the end of the day, we've just got to do better. If we take our faith seriously, we've got to do better. And it's not about the president and it's not about political parties. When we relegate it to political discussions, we denigrate the importance of these conversations. as if we take Jesus seriously in terms of what Phil even referred to, and I mentioned earlier, the whole idea of the year of Jubilee. And the kingdom of God involves the marginalized being prioritized and the oppressed being released from their oppression and the captives being set free and the good news being preached to the poor being prioritized. If we take those kinds of things seriously, then we will see that we must take racial injustice seriously in our context here in the 21st century in America. Well, I want to thank the Pablo Center for hosting us. I want to thank, hold on for just one second. Adam's got something.
Yes. Before we close out for the night, I just wanted to highlight an event, a really exciting event that's going on at Artisan Forge Studios. Opening tomorrow is the Full Moon Autumn Chinese exhibit. This is a cultural exchange with a Chinese company, and there are several mini events going on throughout the month to celebrate this excellent exchange of cultural art. You can find out more on Facebook on Artisan Forge Studios page or the event Full Moon Autumn Chinese Exhibit.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, we definitely wanted to mention that. So again, thank you to Pablo, Uniting Bridges. Thank you to Converge Radio. Thanks to our wonderful panelists for walking through this with us tonight. Next week, we're going to talk about the indigenous experience in the Chippewa Valley, and we're going to do that as a celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day. So I hope that you'll join us again next week. Thank you so much for listening in. This has been Conversations in Color. Have a great night.